Okay, I'm joined here with Mr. Simon Dixon. We have not yet met, and I'm pretty burnt out with the crypto space, to be honest. I've been around for a long time, and I've seen that there's almost no good faith left in crypto, and it's been that way for many years. And then with all of the Epstein stuff that's coming out and the hijacking Bitcoin narrative that it seems to be taking off, I saw some of your videos being shared around, and I'm like, okay, I'll click. Let's see what this guy has to say. And I only watched a couple videos, but what was very clearly communicated in those videos was that this is somebody who is trying to have intellectual integrity and give their unique perspective on Bitcoin having been around for a long time. So that's very, very rare, as I'm sure you've been around for a while. I'm sure you've seen many of the same patterns. So I really wanted just to talk with you and get some information exchange, because you're saying that you, in your perspective, we're missing part of the story here, maybe a big part of the story about what is being called the hijacking of Bitcoin, or the appearance of hijacking Bitcoin. And I thought, well, let's hear this guy's perspective. He's been around for a while, and he's trying to be intellectually integritous. So thanks for coming on the show, and it's nice to meet you.
All right, pleasure. Yeah, look, so I think, I spent a bunch of time going through what we learned about Jeffrey Epstein's communications. And so I was kind of going through them in real time. And, I joined Bitcoin in 2011, spoke at the conference in Prague that was hosted by Amir Taki. Invested in about 100 different Bitcoin companies. And so I kind of got a lot of the inside track. And at the same time, when you learn these different things, I've been divesting from Bitcoin companies for as much as I can, because, as this industry became more and more Wall Street, and became more, degenerate gambling and all sorts of leverage and stuff like that. I kind of still am. I find retreat in just Bitcoin and self-custody. And so, I'm kind of going back to that purist side after being around the block, so to speak. And so, I think it's interesting because we're seeing people that feel a bit vindicated because they're seeing things, and then everyone's connecting their experience. And I think it's best to actually understand what actually happened, because my end conclusion, I'll give a spoiler. There was a very clear divide and conquer strategy that involved multiple infiltrations. And what people, I think, are doing is they're picking the one that they want to be vindicated by, channeling on that, and then painting a narrative around it. And to a degree, we're probably all doing the same.
Yeah.
But when I try and look at it from the perspective of, what is real here and what tried to happen, I think the whole community was played, and I think it's worth exploring what we've learned from it.
Yes, and I think that makes the value of possible information exchange here that much greater. So if people aren't aware of, just a short introduction on my end, I also started learning about Bitcoin back in 2011. I was at a Mises University conference in Auburn, Alabama, where people started talking about it. I was writing articles about it back in 2013, and then wrote my first book on Bitcoin called What's the Big Deal About Bitcoin in 2014. And then most recently, I helped Roger Ver write Hijacking Bitcoin. So also been around the space for a while, and part of the motivation, I've said this multiple places, that part of the motivation actually for me personally helping with Roger on this project is that I felt like I couldn't leave Bitcoin and the crypto industry with a good conscience with all this information, the story that almost nobody has heard. Somehow we had the dominant perspective that was in Bitcoin evaporated, and then nobody wrote it somehow. We lasted several years where nobody even has encountered the other side of the story, and I felt like I want to get out of this space because I see a lot of the patterns that you're describing, but I wanted to, it was like a voice and exit concept. Before you leave, you say your voice, and then you leave. That was kind of the motivation here.
Your swan song.
Yeah. One of the ways I want to structure this is, when we're exchanging information, it's technical points will come up, and I really want to try to avoid getting lost in technical weeds, though we have to have some exceptions because some of the technical points end up mattering greatly. And I know this is one of the I don't want to have any debates to the extent we can avoid it about technical matters unless they're necessary. But what I wanted to do is sync up with you on what you are perceiving with, let's say, what appears to be the case that there is a rollout right now of digital dollars, CBDCs, that was brought in perhaps on the coattails of Bitcoin. The people got really excited about crypto, and they're like, yeah, this is the future. And then the world that we are in right now is like custodial Bitcoin, which sort of undermines the whole idea of Bitcoin, plus Tether and CBDCs. And if we agree on that, then we can maybe start retelling the story of what we think exactly happened. So you are seeing this pattern, is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we've often been told, like, some people believe that Bitcoin came from the intelligence community. And I believe there's an element of truth, but not the truth, that a bit more nuanced there. I think the project was open sourced from those connected to the intelligence community. And I do think the cypherpunks, to certain degrees, work, because, a lot of the cryptography and technology does come from, military, let's face it. And so, I think a resistance within projects that were probably involved from, in intelligence. And they obviously wanted to create what is being created right now, which is a digital, programmable, artificial intelligence connected social credit score 1984 Orwellian nightmare version of fiat currency. And that is being built as we speak. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that from the intelligence community, there was a runaway element that open sourced this project, published a white paper, called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto. And I think one would ask, what are the reasons why, the NSA or intelligence might be interested? One obvious thing that people will say is there's a backdoor. And then when you understand the technical architecture, you realize that's just a very amateur argument. But the other one, which I think is true, is that it's a gateway drug to the architecture that would service this digital dollar nightmare that we're going through right now. So I do think that there was an attempt to, if you look at DigiCash and the privacy options and various other things that preceded this, I think it's clear they wanted to create what is being created now. And I do think this was an offshoot from that. And I think the reason for it was to use Bitcoin. It's out there, it's in the sphere. And then they were adjusting to that reality. But the gateway drug, I think, is the plausible story of why intelligence might be interested in this tech. Okay,
let me ask you one question here. So when you say, what they're rolling out now is this surveillance coin, surveillance system, it is very terrifying. In fact, Roger Ver, I heard in one of his interviews, he said something along the lines of, we're building the financial prison walls around ourselves. And I was like, ooh, that's quite a phrase. And I see that pattern in lots of projects, the most obvious which are Tether and stablecoins. However, the first question would be, let's imagine a future in which Bitcoin remains capped in terms of its scalability on the first layer. So we end up with Bitcoin as it is at present, BTC as it is at present, the same fundamental structure and design is fixed for 15, 20 years from now. Do you see that as also part of the dystopia? Because one might say, well, in a world in which people are only operating on second layers that are all custodial, even if BTC is technically the supposed asset that's underpinning these transactions, if it's custodial anyway, you're already in dystopia land. So we don't even have to go to Tether and CBDCs, as terrifying as those are. But custodial Bitcoin is also like, as we coined it some years ago, panopticon, a panopticoin already, if it's just capped as it is right now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think we got to. So, firstly, custody is the attack vector, no doubt about it. But then when you're talking about custodial services, I think we've got a nuance there that we need to understand. So, I assume you're talking about those that have Lightning Layer 2 custodial setups.
So Lightning would be an example, but even more basic would be somebody thinks that they're owning Bitcoin, but it's via PayPal, or it's via an institution, a Wall Street institution that owns it on their behalf.
Yeah, so let's say the unregulated custodial, which I think is a technical debate, is a bit nuanced and around layer 2. But then you've got the actual just straightforward custody. Custody is the attack vector. And if you look at the story of gold, it is that you created the ability for you to own your own bearer asset, which was gold. And it's so clunky, big, and expensive that you have to store it at a custodian. And then that custodian creates paper contracts that leads to the creation of fiat currency. And then with that, they use that power in order to lobby and change law so that it's completely legal to do so. And then you have a derivative complex that pushes people into degeneracy. You have more paper contracts than gold. And then you build this entire complex that becomes larger than the entire supply of gold in custody. And then it becomes systemic. And so, that is the history of what happens when you do custody.
Yeah, people who are calling for a Bitcoin standard seem to forget that the gold standard failed. Okay, so if you're going to try to recreate a Bitcoin standard, and instead of gold, it's going to be Bitcoin, like the gold standard failed, and it failed for the reasons that you're describing, because there's a separation between the actual underlying asset and then promises of access to that asset.
Yeah, exactly. So, the reason the gold standard will always fail and a Bitcoin standard will always fail is because it's a paper contract that relies upon law and trust on top. And in times when it's systemically risky to the empire will default on that promise. That's the history of empires.
Okay, let's just hang here for one more minute, because I want to hear your vision. I want to see your vision of what custodial Bitcoin looks like, because we could say, what are the problems with fiat money? One of the issues is you may not own your assets if they're, for example, you've got all your money in the bank, and JP Morgan says you've got $10,000, but then you said something naughty, and so they're going to pause your funds. You no longer have access to that money. So there's the custodial problem, which is obviously a massive, enormous problem. But there are other problems too. There's problems of surveillance, of censorship, which don't necessarily result in confiscation of assets. So here's one criticism, and I'd like to hear your what you think about this. The system as it is, even with custodial Bitcoin, if nothing changes fundamentally, then let's say in 10 years' time, then all of the on-ramps and off-ramps to BTC are already through regulated exchanges. So if you have money that technically can't be confiscated, but the government and the regulatory authorities know how much you have, they know what account it's in, how empowered are you just because they can't necessarily confiscate those assets in a straightforward way, but they can say, well, if you're going to use it to buy anything or purchase anything, then they say, okay, well, make sure you play by the rules. Everything's going to be KYC'd. You're going to be taxed on it. Like, what benefit of that? What is the benefit of that system?
Well, I mean, it's, what does it actually do? So firstly, you've got the ability to own your own money, self-custody. But if you can't do anything with it, obviously they can hinder that. You've got the ability to spend it in an innocent until proven guilty system. Currently, the banking system is a guilty until proven innocent. If you want to send a large transaction, you have to prove that that's for innocent purposes before they let you send it. Especially particularly scale.
Sorry, but just on that, if you send a large transaction on BTC, it's going to be flagged anyway. So it may not be that the transaction is prevented technically, although we could talk about blacklists and that is still conceivably possible. But let's say the transaction goes through, but it's already flagged, and then you get agents knocking at your door 3 days later, right?
Yeah. All of these are legal enforcement challenges. So to step outside that system, whenever you're dealing with a fiat on ramps and a fiat off ramps, everything's going to encounter this issue. The system is designed in order to ensure that actually is how it is set up. There's nothing that can stop that in terms of legal enforcement, or you have to operate outside of the law. And operating outside of the law is a niche because most people don't want to.
Well, let's say, for example, the movement for privacy coins. Like people think that, but people's idea of what Bitcoin is, if they don't really know what they're talking about, is like a Monero. It's supposed to be an anonymous thing, or that you have real financial privacy. That would be an alternative. That would be, even if you're not doing anything illegal with it, it would still be outside of that system, right? Because if the ultimate goal is we're going to empower people financially to have an alternative money, it seemed like a big concession to say, well, you're not actually opting out with Bitcoin because all the on-roads and off-roads are already controlled anyway. So why is it an alternative?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be like, I know that in my everyday life, I am significantly freer with my Bitcoin than I am with my bank. And now whether it's perfection, whether they can subpoena an exchange that finds out my history of purchases, that's just reality. But it doesn't mean that I feel that I live in a country where I can own as much Bitcoin as I want. I feel like I can leave that country with my private key. I feel like I can transact with anybody, but if I become a target of intelligence and I start engaging with sanctioned people, I know that I am creating an immutable record, and I will face the full wrath of the law at some stage, or I will have to face that consequence. Okay. So it doesn't change. It doesn't change the law. The legal system is still there.
Yeah, I think the strongest argument there is that specifically with the idea of being able to leave a country, that there is a unique value proposition, I suppose, in the fact that it's digital, that is going to allow you to leave if you're in that circumstance where you feel like you need to leave. But I think that's a valid argument. But that only applies to like a fraction of a percent of people. People aren't, the idea that people are going to, like, when the time is right, up and move to a different country because they fear, legal persecution, and they're going to move their money with Bitcoin. I think that doesn't really apply. That's not freedom for the masses, right? That's like for the ultra wealthy, ultra elite, ultra flexible who could do something like that.
Yeah. And there is a reality. I mean, I made a transaction today, sizable transaction, multiple millions of dollars. If I tried to do that with a bank, I'd still be here in probably 3 months.
Yeah, Now that's
trying
fair.
to prove that that's a legitimate transaction.
Yeah, that's fair. And if it is a legitimate transaction, then maybe you don't have to expect somebody knocking at your door. So yeah, I think the idea that for ultra high net worth individuals, there's still going to be a unique value proposition. That's fair. That is not I don't think that's what most people got involved at the beginning about. That wasn't sort of the vision of peer to peer cash that's an alternative to state money. But yeah, I could see that still being a valuable use case. Let's try to get more of the story here. So I think you and I are going to agree that there's state and financial interests that were involved early on and paying attention to Bitcoin early on because the prospect of the alternative currency could be very disruptive to their business model, to put it lightly. From the hijacking Bitcoin perspective, we say that, now, especially with the new emails that we have, as early as 2011, people like Epstein were asking questions about Bitcoin, trying to speak with the Bitcoin guys. I believe it was in 2013 or 2014. We have Adam Back and Austin Hill visiting Epstein on his island. And 2014 is also one of these years that's pointed out in the book that seems to be, there was sort of a shift in the culture of Bitcoin. It started to move from Bitcoin is meant to be digital cash, that's an alternative currency, to Bitcoin is digital gold, and you're not really supposed to move it or use it. So we look at that. We look at these emails that are coming out as evidence that, in fact, we were tracking things correctly. And there was always a bunch of smoke around the company Blockstream. I mean, that was sort of the arch villain in the big blocker narrative. And then it comes out, well, Blockstream did take money from Jeffrey Epstein. That I believe Brock Pierce was also involved. Howard Lutnick is involved via Tether. So Tether was directly investing in Blockstream. Like a bunch of people were saying there's a bunch of smoke around Blockstream, and then now it appears like, there's a bunch of fire around Blockstream as well. Is that your perspective also?
That's half the story. I think there's a load more that we get from. So we should probably go through them in a chronological order and get what we think we can learn from it. But I do think there was multiple. Firstly, I think it's worth defining what we think Jeffrey Epstein was and is. So my understanding of Jeffrey Epstein is that there are thousands of Jeffrey Epsteins. It's not a unique case. He is a compromise agent, and this is how power works. If you want to climb the ranks of power, the higher you want to go, the more compromised you have to be, because it's a self-enforcing network where everybody is compromised and therefore no one deviates from power structure. And then once you deviate or you are no longer useful to power, you switch from an asset to a liability and you get taken out. That is what I believe Jeffrey Epstein was. And and I do believe that Brock Pierce was somebody that tried to grow within that power network. And so, here's how I think it works. That if you want to rise to power, firstly, you have different levels of infiltration. The very first level is that you try and invest or fund, and then you see what they're willing to do. And as they're willing to do, you try and invest and fund more and make someone more subordinate. And then maybe you have physical meetings, and maybe you try and honeypot someone into escorts. And then as you climb the ranks, it gets ever more degenerate, where suddenly you're trying to invite them to an island and get compromised with minors and various other things. And that's how I think these types of networks work. But as Jeffrey Epstein, who works for greater power, you have to prove your utility to power. So you're always trying to bring new assets into the compromised network. And somebody like Brock Pierce that would hang around with someone like Jeffrey Epstein, he's trying to climb the ranks. And so he's trying to prove his utility to someone like Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein is trying to improve his utility to someone higher up in intelligence. And you just go higher and higher up. But it's like a mafia where you can never leave. Because if you stop being an asset, then there are all ways of making you disappear.
Okay, let's we'll return to your interpretation of the timeline. I do want to sort of comment on this. So I think that's a reasonable hypothesis about Epstein and his network and how the game is played. I do think that's part of what's going on. I also think there's a possibility here that so while there might be, I don't think I would say there are thousands of Epsteins. I think there are thousands of Epstein aspirants who would like to be Epstein. I think functionally there's a lot of low-level players. I suspect that at that level, there probably aren't that many Epsteins. I think he was ultra elite just by what we've seen from the emails. I also do think that it's hard to say. So he was obviously working for people as an information dealer, but it also could be that let's say that level of power and influence is very incestuous anyway. So I'm not sure how many more levels above him there need to be. I'm not saying that there aren't, but I do think he was already hobnobbing with what we know of as the richest and most powerful, influential people that there are. And so whether or not, he is an asset of an intelligence agency, it's obviously that's part of his network, but I don't want to rule out the possibility that this is just sort of the type of incest that we see, not even necessarily through compromise, just through relationship building, through money moving, through even in some of these emails, it's women sharing. They appear to have, there's an assistant that Jeffrey is with, and then somebody else is with as well. So they're sharing money, resources, women, and I'm not sure that it's all in the compromise picture. It could also just be this is what those types of people do. Okay, so that's my take, but I think go ahead.
Well, I think it's worth saying, and then we'll move on. But I do agree that there is the supply side and there is demand. So the people that demand these services should be called out because it's not like we forced you to do this; it's that you are willing to do this. So there's that part to say. And if you look at specifically Jeffrey Epstein. We found who the different co-conspirators are. That was released by Thomas Massey this week. But Ghislaine Maxwell, she was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, and Robert Maxwell was connected to Mossad and Israeli intelligence. And Jeffrey Epstein was manufactured to look like a billionaire financier at Bear Stearns. But he was, in fact, the trustee and manager of Lex Wexner's wealth. And Lex Wexner, via Victoria's Secrets, had a whole grooming gang. And so, you've got...
And one more note on that. I think this is very important for people as they're thinking about these networks. It would be a mistake to think that somebody like Epstein has a net worth. So I think the way that these systems operate is that it's shared wealth. So to say how much of Lex Wexner's, whatever his last name is, how much of his estate is owned by Epstein, I think it's more fluid than that. So I think there's a big network all over the world of people that are scratching one another's backs. They don't even know what their total assets are because there are mutual legal claims on the same piece of property, but there were unwritten contracts about what the expectations are. So I think kind of the lines between who owns what is very blurry in that world.
And that is a Bitcoin story as well, because net worth, we think of these high net worth individuals. A lot of it is financialization and securitization. And there is loans against those paper assets. And there are multiple rehypothecated claims on those assets. And so in the end, it's not like these high net worth people, their billions and billions are in Bitcoin and gold. Their billions and billions is paper wealth. And paper wealth can be manipulated, and you can wipe out someone's wealth if they're leveraged in a heartbeat. And that is a compromise vehicle to wipe out someone's net worth.
Yes, and also not just paper wealth, but also networks and untapped networks. So, for example, if we were to ask the question, how much could Jeffrey Epstein raise in the context in which he needed to raise X billion number of dollars? Well, I don't know what that number is, but when he starts calling in those favors, that might be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars or more for all we know. So that's not in paper wealth. That's not designated to him. That's sort of in the latent potential of the network and the relationships that he had built.
Yeah, correct. All right, so let's move on from that. So looking at the Epstein files, there were a bunch of fake stuff saying he was Satoshi.
No.
That was all BS.
Yep.
You couldn't authenticate any of that in the DOJ website. So people were deliberately engaging in market manipulation or narrative building. But the very first communication we do have is that in 2011, that was the year I joined Bitcoin, Jeffrey Epstein clearly was trying to figure out who's the who in Bitcoin. And if you were around in 2011 like you were, you'll know that kind of initially Amir Tarki got connected to Bitcoin on the BBC and media because he was a type of character where you could connect drug usage to Bitcoin, and the media loved that. And there was a whole thing around Silk Road, Bitcoin, and all that type of drug usage. And he lived in a squat and various other things. So, and then at some stage, it was apparent that Amir Tarki shouldn't really be the face of Bitcoin because people would consider him the CEO at that point.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of evidence that a lot of those stories were true of Amir, right? Of him being involved in I don't know how to describe it, but unsavorable activities and environments.
Well, he would proudly say it on TV. He was very young, right. He would go on TV and say, "Do you know what is great about Bitcoin? You can launder money and buy drugs." And he would say it. So then kind of Gavin Andreessen became a little bit of the face of Bitcoin. So he was the first developer that Satoshi handed the project over to. There was communication. And then obviously Roger Ver became an investor, and he started advocating for Bitcoin and became very public. And so really those were like in 2011, the different faces you would find if you were looking to find out who's the who in Bitcoin.
Okay.
And so Jeffrey Epstein attempted to contact Amir Tarki. Amir Tarki said, go and meet my partner in a project. I remember he was developing Dark Wallet, which was a wallet that would kind of use what later became like coin joins and anonymity and stuff for Bitcoin. And then apparently what he said, he publicly responded to this on X. And he said that they were going to go get funding. His partner in the project met him and then came back and rejected his funding. There was communications where Gavin Andreessen just said, "I'm too busy to meet." And so that was, the first attempts to try and communicate with people and figure out. So the way I interpret that is Jeffrey Epstein wanted to engage in compromise of key figures in Bitcoin because it's an emerging technology. And either he wanted to figure out whether this is useful for some of the activities that he would engage in, or he started to figure out whether he could network with the key people, compromise the key people, and be useful to power in this.
One addition here. So I believe I'm going to get the timeline correct. People can correct me if I'm incorrect. This is all based on recent emails. So I think it was in 2011 that Gavin was asked by the CIA to give a talk about Bitcoin. And he makes a post saying like, "Hey, they've asked me to do this. This means we're on their radar, and I want to be out in the open that I'm going to go do this so that people aren't concerned about possible compromise." And I believe this is the new claim that it was shortly after that, like I believe it was like a month later, that's when Epstein starts asking if he can meet with the Bitcoin people and try to figure out who the Bitcoin guys are. So it's conceivably possible that, obviously they were Bitcoin was on the CIA's radar back then. That's why they reached out to him. But it's conceivably possible that Epstein was tasked with trying to figure out who the key players are after this meeting with Gavin. Chronologically, that would fit at least. And to Gavin's credit, he did, at least in the records that we have, he did decline to meet with Epstein. And then we have an email from Epstein simply saying, "Oh yeah, Gavin is clever." Right, and I believe this was right after he declined to meet him. So Epstein did meet with some of the developers. He didn't meet with Gavin, and there's a question, at least in my mind, also still, is Gavin a legit player, or was he possibly not? Was he possibly compromised? And I don't know. I'm like at least 80%. I think he's legit. I've never met him. I've never spoken with him, but I get a little suspicious vibe from him. I'll be honest, but like everything that I've seen, I think he's legit. And the fact that he did snub Epstein to me puts more points in his favor.
Yeah. So if we look at the timeline, Gavin Andreessen becomes the first developer that Satoshi gives commit access to. Then in 2011, we had that timeline where Jeffrey Epstein. So Gavin Andreessen says publicly on the Bitcoin Talk forum, "I'm going to go meet the CIA." Satoshi says, "I'm leaving the project."
Well, that's not quite right. No, that wasn't because there was an intermediate step there where when Satoshi, I believe the last thing we have from Satoshi is when they're talking about WikiLeaks. There's somebody says in the thread there was like some news article about WikiLeaks accepting donations in Bitcoin, and then Satoshi says, "Okay, I think this is a bad idea. You're gonna sort of kick the wasp nest, and they're coming after us," and then he leaves. So I don't think it was after the CIA thing. I think it was after the WikiLeaks thing.
Yeah, do you know the from memory? I don't know if you know. Do you know the time difference between the WikiLeaks, CIA?
I don't.
Okay, so that's worth looking into. In the comments, they can do the DD.
Okay.
But we're working from memory. I haven't done that.
Yeah, it would be in 2011, or couldn't be less than. No,
this was all around the same time.
Yeah.
Then Satoshi left, and from my perspective, I speculate that the most likely candidate to be Satoshi is somebody called Len Sassaman. Mm-hmm. And he committed suicide 1 month after that, after Satoshi left.
Okay, just a point of clarification. I just Googled here. It looks like the last known email was sent April 23rd, 2011. Okay, I don't know if that's 100% true. That's just what the AI tells me in real time. So this is tracking what you're saying here.
And when was the CIA Gavin Andreessen post?
I X'd out of the thing. Hey, I'll pull it up again while you're talking.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So that timeline is worth just nailing down because I think it's very interesting. So that's what we got confirmation of in the Epstein files. Whether we believe they are true as well, these could all be red herrings. Everything's crazy. Then I think it's really important to fast forward 3 years to 2014. 2014. For anyone that was around, it was kind of like if you went through the FTX year, that's what 2014 was like, but 10 times worse. 2014 was on so many levels a disaster to be involved in Bitcoin. And this is when I think we really start to see the character. So from my memory, I was a shareholder in BitPay.
Yep.
And BitPay was pitching for finance. Max Kaiser and myself invested in BitPay. And at the time, if you were a developer, you'd put up a QR code and people would fund and people would contribute. Then BitPay agreed as a corporate entity to pay some of the developer funding. And everyone was complaining about a company paying for developer funding at the time. And so then people were like, well, what's a better structure? And so this is when we get the Bitcoin Foundation. And then the Bitcoin Foundation comes along where all the Bitcoiners could give some Bitcoin. And on the board were the who's who of Bitcoin. That included people like Charlie Schwem, who created BitInstant, a gateway into Mt. Gox. That included people like John Matonis, who was the later chairman, Roger Ver, Mark Capellis, who bought an exchange from the creator of Ripple that was missing 80,000 Bitcoin. And who else was there? There was Gavin Andreessen as well, I believe. And later came Brock Pierce. And so Brock Pierce already had a background from public information where he was involved in Hollywood as a child actor. I don't think that, that's a bad thing in itself, but we know what Hollywood is about as a childhood actor. You can imagine what type of circles you're in. We also know that during the dot-com boom and bust, he had a tech startup that was meant to go public and then failed. And there were allegations and settlements around minors that claimed that there were sexual, I'm careful with my language on YouTube, you get the point, this type of degeneracy. And I believe that those problems went away and there was settlements. And so we know that he already had this type of background. Now, when he came into the Bitcoin Foundation, he came with money. And at this point, there were no VCs. This was such a different place. Roger Ver and myself were investing in companies, and it was because we both did well with Bitcoin. He did well in entrepreneurship prior to that. But there was no money in this industry, so the Bitcoin Foundation became the place where you could contribute, and then it was more decentralized than just BitPay, because there was a bunch of companies and a not-for-profit and a more decentralized structure. But Bitcoiners being Bitcoiners, we don't trust anything, and so everyone was always angry at what the Bitcoin Foundation was doing.
Well,
and
let me put a little bit more nuance on that. So there was still factions in the Bitcoin Foundation world. So I know people like Amir Taki, Cody Wilson were saying, abolish the Bitcoin Foundation, good riddance in principle, we can't have any centralized development. There were still others, like Mike Hearn, for example. I mean, Mike Hearn was critical afterwards, who was trying to say, look, you have to have some formal industry. You have to have some formal structure. Let's not kid ourselves and saying like somehow there was just going to be this purely emergent thing. So not everybody was necessarily critical of the Bitcoin Foundation. One more question. Do you remember when Brock Pierce came in as the head of the Bitcoin Foundation? This might end up being an important part of the storyline here.
Yeah, we'd have to check that one.
Okay.
It was later. My memory says it wasn't from the beginning.
Okay, that would be fascinating if it was, especially because of the Epstein connections with Pierce, and you saying that, or what we know that after the failure of the Bitcoin Foundation, development financing moved to MIT, which Epstein also did contribute a little bit of money to. One more thing before we get off track, I was pulling up the dates for the Satoshi Nakamoto emails, and I do think this is actually this is intriguing. You and I were both incorrect here. So on April 23rd, we've got an email from Satoshi saying, I've moved on to other things. The project is in good hands with Gavin. On April 23rd, 2011. April 27th, 4 days later, is when Gavin says, I was asked to do a talk at the CIA. Now I think a reasonable, that this is very intriguing. I think a reasonable speculative position is that Gavin was not asked on the 27th. Gavin was probably asked to go earlier, and then I would imagine he would tell Satoshi about that. So it's very plausible that those two things are connected. That Satoshi decided to leave before Gavin went to the CIA, knowing that was going to happen, and he didn't want to be involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so we're at the Bitcoin Foundation now.
Okay, yeah. So before the Bitcoin Foundation went bust, I think there's a bunch of things that need to be explored there. So the first thing is we get confirmation that Peter Thiel, who's ex connections to PayPal, Silicon Valley, he was messaging Jeffrey Epstein and talked about how, the Bitcoin community is a bit confused. Jeffrey Epstein was saying they don't know if it's a store of value, a median of exchange, unit of account. I'm paraphrasing, but words to that effect. The Bitcoin guys are all crazy. And there was some wording around Peter Thiel saying, "Is this part of the?" I can't remember the word. I got to get the word right. Destabilization campaign or something. Or there was communications between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Thiel that implies there was a deliberate campaign in order to discredit Bitcoin. And then Jeffrey Epstein was talking about medium of exchange, unit of account, whether it's a currency or anything like that. So
but we do have in 2017. I didn't know this. Man, I wish I knew this before I helped with hijacking Bitcoin. But we do have the only thing that I've ever seen that Jeffrey Epstein wrote publicly about Bitcoin is from an interview at thenextweb.com. Have you seen this from 2017?
No, I haven't seen that one. No.
Okay, I'll have to send it to you. It's actually, I can't believe it's been hidden, but he's essentially making the case that Bitcoin is supposed to be a store of value and it's not really a medium of exchange. So he was sort of repeating the store of value line in public in 2017 when he was interviewed. So that's another interesting piece of the story here.
Yeah, so Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were communicating around what appears to be a deliberate campaign, and the debate was around store of value, unit of account, and all this type of, this type of debate. I interpret that as that there was a deliberate campaign to divide the community, and the narrative was being formed, and I think it came from Peter Thiel, and Jeffrey Epstein was somebody that was, involved in those communications. So that's 2014. What else happened in 2014? So Brock Pierce funded a project called Realcoin, that later rebranded as Tether and was sold to Bitfinex. And so Brock Pierce was the founder of what later became Tether.
And it should be noted that Tether was also Tether and Bitfinex have essentially the same C-suite. They were directly investing hundreds of millions of dollars into Blockstream. They have raised hundreds.
We've got to get the timing of that right. So I'm not sure which round they came in, whether it was seed or later round.
This was later.
I know it came. Did it come seed or later?
No,
round?
That was later. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, later round. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then Brock Pierce, who appears to me to be trying to become useful to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, remember, 2008, he's a convicted, he's Jeffrey Epstein's already been convicted. So everyone knows what Jeffrey Epstein's about. If you've done any, Google will tell you what he was about in 2008. And so Brock Pierce was in those circles. And he appeared to be trying to, I feel like the relationship was Brock Pierce was trying to be useful to Jeffrey Epstein as a higher up in the hierarchy. I could be wrong. That's just what I speculate. And he was seeding funding to Jeffrey Epstein and affiliated entities like Digital Garage. One of them was an introduction to Coinbase. One of them was a venture capital fund that was set up. So Max Kaiser and myself set up Bitcoin Capital, and Brock Pierce set up Blockchain Capital with other fund managers. Blockchain Capital invested in everything, kind of like Digital Currency Group and Barry Silbert. So this made up the kind of the venture capital entrance. And Peter Thiel, via Founders Fund, invested in BitPay, if memory serves me well, and started making some investments. So round about 13, 14, 15, you got the entrance of Silicon Valley. And then
another player we should mention here is Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman, co-founder or founder or co-founder of LinkedIn. All throughout the Epstein emails, he was the individual that led the seed round for Blockstream back in 2014, I want to say it was, and then was also on the board, I think it was also in 2014. So he is another one of these players here that appears to be very friendly with Epstein.
Yeah. So anyway, Blockstream factioned off some of the key developers and key people in the community, put it into a corporate shell, and it was raised a chunk of money that was oversubscribed, and started to be this connection between TradFi, Silicon Valley, legacy finance with like AXA and various others, and started to become one of the key corporate entities that had and paid major characters in core development via Blockstream. Then we had Coinbase, which was a key company in the block war debate on the big blocker side. And then we had BitPay, who was on the big blocker side, and then Blockstream on the small blocker side, what later became the debate. So to me, there was infiltration across every side of the corporate entities. And then obviously Barry Silbert as well was on the big blocker side as well.
Let me present an alternative picture here. So the way that I'm trying to make the easiest explanation in my mind for what was happening with Blockstream is the people who hijacked Bitcoin had in their mind that we're going to transition from digital cash to digital gold, where you actually hold it, and we're going to get a Bitcoin standard where you're going to go through institutions to access your Bitcoin. And this is the way that traditional finance can come in, detooth Bitcoin, make it just another asset people hold, and it loses its revolutionary value. And so when I'm thinking about Blockstream being the key player here in hiring several of the key developers that insisted on not scaling Bitcoin the way that Satoshi designed Bitcoin to scale, there's always been an open question in how do they get paid? What's the final payoff? One laughably suspicious way that they make money is by offering their own alternative blockchain. They have a proprietary blockchain called the Liquid Network, which it appears that they were trying to get nation states onboarded to the Liquid Network. And on the Liquid Network, they would make 100% of all the transaction fees. And we have an email from, I want to say it was Austin Hill, saying that he's got all these world-improving projects. He's going to make the world a better place and give free healthcare to people. And it's going to be financed in part by taking a small transaction fee on entire nation states' cash float. Okay, so that's one like ham-fisted way that Blockstream can profit, is by just saying we're going to give you an alternative to Bitcoin, even though they were hiring Bitcoin developers. However, I think in hindsight, just in the past few years, Blockstream has raised hundreds and hundreds. In fact, it's over $500 million that they've raised. And my interpretation of that new money is as payoff. If it was the case that Blockstream's job was to ensure that Bitcoin did not scale the way that it was designed to scale, and ensure that we transitioned into this custodial Bitcoin world, then the promise is delay long enough so we can roll out CBDCs and digital dollars, and then we're going to invest in your company to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. And that is what we've seen. And who are the late comers that paid those hundreds of millions of dollars? Go figure. It's Tether. And also, I just came across an article recently. I'm trying to verify this because some of the links that were in the article were broken, and it was from, I want to say it was from CoinDesk, and from last year, where they said that Blockstream had secured multiple billions for creating some type of a fund that was going to be, backed with Bitcoins. Multiple billions. Now, if that's true, then I feel like the payoff theory has a lot of credence to it, that you broke this technology, you delayed it long enough so the big wigs could come in, and now you're not just making hundreds of millions, you're making billions. So alternative theory that people should entertain as they're listening to the story.
Yeah. So I disagree with the framing. I don't think they broke the technology, but if we look at the things that they did, they were advocating, for as an influential voice in the argument that in order to remain more decentralized, we need a fee market and we need nodes that are trivial to run. And then we get into the debate, which I don't think is worth having. But just because you framed it in the break Bitcoin, I personally don't believe they did break Bitcoin.
Let me just ask you one question so we don't argue about it. Were it the case that technical vision doesn't check out, and in fact the vision of everybody's going to run your own node, if that doesn't actually work and it doesn't actually scale, would you, in that world, I'm not saying that that's the world, even though I believe it to be the case, would you then think one could interpret their actions as breaking Bitcoin at the technical level?
No, well, I mean, we've got 25,000 nodes, and running nodes are the only people that are getting a vote in this knots versus core debate right now. So the whole concept of a user-activated soft fork and a resistance against the miners, I think, is a very important feature and is proving to be an important feature right now.
So that's one of those areas we have to have that conversation, but we can't have it now because we're going to get sidetracked. So maybe that one's one where we have to talk about that, and we have to do a little bit of technical argument. But let's try to put that at the end.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, but you are quite right. There were different types of technologies that were created within the corporate shell of Blockstream, like Liquid. And what is Liquid? It was a federated network of banks, essentially, where you could launch shitcoins, and it was a more centralized, federated network, and that existed on top of Bitcoin. I don't think that really means or matters much to Bitcoin itself, but those technologies, like anyone can launch a coin on anything, but there was that federated network that's very suspicious in terms of the actors that were running those nodes within Liquid. It shows deep connections to banks and financial institutions. The billions that you may be referring to is that they did launch products for Bitcoin mining, and so they created security tokens or something.
Nope. This is different than that.
Okay. And so anyway, a company with a very questionable business model, brought in a bunch of the Bitcoin core developers under a corporate wrapper. And once you have a corporate wrapper, you are subordinate to your shareholders. And those shareholders, you have fiduciary duty to those shareholders. And those shareholders, one of the investors was $500,000 introduced, I believe, via Brock Pierce, through Digital Garage into Blockstream. And so that's where you had Blockstream. Now, the important part here is, we then have further confirmations that somebody called, there was a message to Amir Taki, I believe it was 2014, 2015, fact check this, from Jeffrey Epstein saying that Andy Back, not Adam Back, will be visiting the island. Are you still involved in Bitcoin? And so Jeffrey Epstein was trying to invite Amir Taki, knowing that somebody called Andy Back was coming to the island.
Oh, that's Adam Back. Yeah, so we have emails on both sides of that exchange where I'm going to get the details wrong, but the general concept is that he's asking, are you still involved in Bitcoin? I'm going to have Adam Back. He says Andy Back, but I don't know if that's intentional or not. And then there was a response from Austin Hill, who was referring to scheduling details about them coming to the island, and he refers to Adam in that group of people that were coming to the island.
Yeah, so then it listed the Blockstream co-founder, Austin,
Austin Hill.
Adam Back this time.
Yeah.
I think it's very reasonable to say that was the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is Adam Back publicly confirmed, as this revelation came out, that Blockstream did receive funding via Digital Garage and a Jeffrey Epstein affiliated entity. They did confirm that there was meetings with Jeffrey Epstein, so it was known that it was Jeffrey Epstein. It wasn't like via a hidden shell. And they took the money anyway, even though in 2008 it was known if you did your due diligence, then you're not allowed to receive that type of money as a financial institution or whatever it may be. And then he claimed that there was a divestment process, which is very strange. There was communications around conflicts of interest because Jeffrey Epstein also invested in Stellar and Ripple. Whether that means the coin, the entity, I got no idea. But there was communications to say that that's a conflict of interest. And so we the investments were made, but no communication, radio silence around Adam Back confirming whether he went to the island and what was the purpose, and whether he was duped, whether he wasn't. Very, very suspicious that that's not being talked about. You have to address that.
You certainly do, especially when you've got a whole faction of big blockers who've been around for a while, who've been pointing to the corruption here, and then we have a node of the corruption being Jeffrey Epstein himself and this network. Like, that's obviously something that would have to be addressed. So I'm listening to your recollection of events, and then I'm going, okay, well, that seems like there's a bunch of red flags everywhere. So how do we? So far, I think I agree with the most of what you've said. So then, this is also all of this stuff. I wish could have been in Hijacking Bitcoin. It's not because we didn't know some of the details. The tether's not mentioned in the book once, and yet I think this is going to end up being a critical part of the story in hindsight because of the connection through Brock Pierce with Blockstream.
Yeah,
the Epstein thing obviously isn't mentioned because we didn't have any of the emails. So I look at it and I go, okay, we are not just partially validated; we're like hyper validated here. But you're saying there's a big piece of the story here that we're missing.
Yeah. So you've got, the corporate entities at the time were on the side of the big blocker side. So I was shareholders in Coinbase. All of the blockchain.info, BitPay, Kraken. Bitstamp, I was shareholder.
Well, it was now maybe you'll find this an exaggeration. I'm trying not to exaggerate here. I would say it was the overwhelming majority of the industry, big corporate, small corporate. There were a few exceptions like Blockstream, like Bitfinex. Outside of that, almost everybody else was on the side of big blocks.
On the corporate side, absolutely. So it was the corporate position.
Yeah.
Within the community, there was lots and lots of debate around how to scale, what it should be, what it looks like, different implementations. We had Mike Hearn as well. Obviously, we were talking about Mike Hearn. From my memory, I can't remember. I think this was 2015. I can't remember. But Mike Hearn, obviously, he was involved in his scaling solutions and different, implementations. But he left when he was talking about his big gripe was centralization of mining in China.
That's part of this. His big gripe was that he thought Blockstream essentially took over control of the development. I mean, he wrote copious amounts saying that development is captured, and I don't want to involve myself in this project. And the connection with this mining centralization is, he says, if you understand how Bitcoin, the network, was designed, the miners are supposed to be the ones that are calling the shots about how the network upgrades. They're the ones investing tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, not like a small disconnected group of developers. And so part of his legitimate gripe was that there's so much mining in China, there's so much hash power in China. If they're too timid, either for cultural reasons or whatever the reasons are, they're scared about the Great Firewall at the time, maybe because there's some latency problems, whatever it is, that's where the criticism of the Chinese miners came from. It wasn't because of mining centralization, generally speaking. It was that the mining centralization in China has resulted in a type of passivity with regards to Bitcoin development that will break the project.
Yeah. But I think it's worth pointing out that he ended up doing a very public, I'm selling all my Bitcoin, I'm leaving the project. The main thing he was talking about was centralization of mining in China.
That's not the main thing. That's definitely not the main thing. That's one of the arguments I would strongly recommend everybody go back and read Mike Hearn. I think he was the second best mind we ever had in crypto.
Okay. And then he left to go to R3 and create central bank digital currencies for banksters. So that was his next move.
Is that correct? I don't know that part of the story. That he central bank digital currencies. I know he created an alternative blockchain for some period of time, but how was that connected with CBDCs?
R3 was the bank's blockchain, and so then he joined R3 and started working for the bank's blockchain. Which is iterations that became CBDCs and all of those. So you can connect that to the whole Tether story.
Okay.
There was a dramatical exit. There was competing implementations, and then there was an exit to basically doing the stablecoin banks blockchain KYC chain. And I remember I was at an event, and his suggestion was to put KYC on chain. And he came to London to present, and I still remember it very well because he got such a pushback from it.
That's interesting.
But he was pushing the KYC and by hashing your passport into the Bitcoin blockchain and making it KYC chain.
Wow, that's interesting. I don't know this part of the story. What the details of what Mike Hearn did after he left. I do know that he had a lot more realistic perspectives on the relationship between law and crypto than essentially anybody else at the time. He was like way ahead of the curve. Earlier in this conversation, you're saying Bitcoin doesn't get you outside of law, and that's just a fact of the situation that we live in. He was making that argument way ahead of time. So it's definitely plausible that he would, go ahead.
Yeah. And again, you can see narratives because we have our version of events, and I'm trying to be. But if you want to create an alternative reality to your reality of Mike Hearn, he came from Google. He tried to create KYC chain. He was on the bid blocker side. He complained about mining centralization. Then he left and he went to work for the banks on KYC chain. That's Mike Hearn's story.
We definitely have to. I have to update on the miner centralization thing. That really wasn't. That was. It's important because what he identified also in the BCH world, people asked him in I think 2017 or 2018, "Hey, what do you think about Bitcoin Cash?" And he said, "Look, I think it's the same problems. This reminds me of early Bitcoin, and you guys are going to run into the same development problems, and so it's not a serious project because you've not dealt with the issue of how do you finance." And structure and organize development on your chain, and unless you've solved that problem, it's going to fail. And he was kind of correct on that. So it's not I'm not going to say it entirely tarnishes his reputation to say that he went and said, okay, good riddance with these silly non-serious people in Bitcoin. I'm gonna go work for officialdom and actually try to build something that works and scales. I think that's thematically, I could see that.
Yeah. I think some other points. So round about this time, I went to meet all the Chinese miners. I was at like the scaling meetings, the Hong Kong meetings, all those different meetings. And I remember meeting Jihan Wu at Bitmain. Now, I can't remember the timing, but I think it's worth fact-checking when Sequoia Capital invested. So we had, venture capital funding coming into Bitmain. And obviously Jihan Wu, from my memory, was the entity that sponsored the creation of Bitcoin Cash. And he called it Bitcoin ABC. And he had a blog of it on Bitmain. And then he later took it down. And then kind of other people became the face for the project. But I remember it was very much a Jihan Wu led initiative.
So I can speak to some of that. So the situation was the industry, the wider, if you want to call it, the corporate side of a crypto, but the Bitcoin industry that was developed at that time kept running into issues with the Bitcoin core developers because they weren't scaling in the most obvious way that Satoshi designed the system to scale. And so there were multiple attempts to try to get them to change. They had the Bitcoin core developers agreed on multiple occasions to particular increases to the block size limit. but they failed to execute on multiple occasions what they had promised. And so why Bitcoin ABC was created was as a backup option, just in case the SegWit 2x agreement failed. They wanted to have an option that didn't have SegWit in it and also had a block size increase. So the idea was, we don't trust Bitcoin Core developers to follow through on their agreements because we've been burned. So now we have a backup option to get around them in case SegWit 2x failed. That's where the origin was. Yeah.
And I remember it very well, the Hong Kong agreement. Like, it was, the miners were there, the core developers were there, and SegWit 2x was the agreed path. Yeah. I remember that very well.
Yeah. So, and then that failed, and so that's why a lot of people started switching to Bitcoin Cash, because that was the version, the implementation, of Bitcoin that people thought they were building towards in the industry for the prior several years. That, like, we care about digital cash, we care about low transaction fees. Satoshi designed the system to scale this way, so that's why we're going to switch over. But if you also remember, I can't think of anybody off the top of my head who was a major player that wanted Bitcoin Cash over SegWit 2x. Everybody, I know Roger included, was like, listen, that's a backup option. We want to keep the industry together, and this is only in case Core doesn't follow through with their end of the bargain. So, yeah.
Now, okay, so, to recap, we got Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein talking about infiltration, what it looked like to me. Around unit of account, store of value, median of exchange, all that type of stuff. We have Brock Pierce enter the fold through venture capital, the creation of what later became Tether. We had introduction to investments across Blockstream and most of the corporate entities that were big blockers. And then we had the bankruptcy and the discrediting of almost all factions of the Bitcoin Foundation. So we had the taking out of Mt. Gox. We had the Willy bot that was developed. We had the fact that, and I remember Mark Capellas saying it wasn't Mt. Gox, it was the code. And so he started blaming the code, transaction malleability for the issue.
I remember that. Yes.
Yeah. We had Charlie Shrem arrest. I think it was that year as well.
This is earlier. This is like still 2015, 2014 era you're talking here.
Yeah. From the court records, like Roger Ver dealing with his tax thing right now, I think if you look at the records, 2014 were the kind of transactions where I think he was restructuring. I can't talk to any of that, but it appears that there is leverage on Roger Ver to do with tax. I don't know what the case is, what's happening right now.
Where does that come from?
Well, if you look at the court documents, I think they're looking back to unpaid tax from, and again, this is no opinion. I maintained relationship with Roger Ver. I'm not trying to tarnish anyone's character here. But I think the fact that he has recently, been effectively taken out for transactions centered around tax from around about this time is another interesting part of the equation.
But when you said, do you think that they've got leverage on him? I don't know about this. Where do you get that idea from?
The tax authorities clearly have leverage over Roger Ver because they're deciding whether he goes to prison or not.
He has been. They did settle, so he is free. Thank God.
Great. So again,
sorry. So let me just try to rephrase. I just want to be clear. Is what you're saying that okay? I think I see what you're saying. That Roger Ver might have been compromised as early as 2014, 2015 for tax reasons. And so when we saw what happened with the block size war unravel the way that it did, that might be connected to Roger having had, the U.S. government has leverage over him in some way. Is that the claim?
Yeah, I mean, these are very weak connections, but I'm just putting it out there. Roger Ver was in prison. A compromise technique is to allow prison sentences to go away and therefore they cash in on their leverage. And if you suddenly get taken out again, it may be that your leverage, you're not performing whatever leverage you have.
When you say he was in prison, you mean about the
pre-Bitcoin firecracker BS.
So I just want to be clear about your position. You're saying that he served, I don't remember what the time was. I think it was like a year, maybe it was less than that, some number of months in prison. And the fact that he went out implies that maybe he made a deal with them that would then be leveraged during the block size wars.
Yeah, again, I'm coming from so my personal relationship with Roger is
I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to understand what the claims are. So because I've interacted with the guy, and I helped write the book. Like, obviously, I don't get that impression. I don't see any evidence of that at all. He could be acting, but there's another.
It's kind of just piecing together if you look at leverage and intelligence, they have multiple ways. There is funding, there is prison sentences, there is leverage over multiple aspects that they might utilize their leverage. And so if you look at all these different players, if we're being fair, we need to look at all the different leverage points across all these multiple potential compromise layers that could happen here.
Okay, yeah, I definitely think that one is a stretch. The idea that first, conviction, he's like making a deal to get out and then they hold it over his head or something. It's logically possible, but I don't see any evidence. I think any evidence of that, and overwhelming evidence that he really was serious about trying to get big block Bitcoin to make the world a better, freer place. The dude's super ideological.
Remember how these things work as well. Yeah. People make value calls and judgment calls.
Yeah.
Many people don't know who they work for. Many people are affiliated with somebody else that may be compromised. This is how these plausible deniability operations work. They break them up into layers, and most people have no idea who they're working for.
Fair. Okay, so
the agenda is pushed down.
So let's keep going through this timeline. So we have. So give me your take then. So we established in that timeline, maybe Roger was compromised and was working for somebody that maybe he was, to use a phrase to put words in your mouth, playing the role of a useful idiot, in the sense that he doesn't know who he's working for and he's advancing interests that are actually contrary to the spirit of Bitcoin. So that's the beginning of the alternative timelines in 2017. Keep playing it out for us.
Yeah. So and then obviously we have what we know was revealed around the MIT Digital Currency Initiative and the bankruptcy of the Bitcoin Foundation. So almost everybody that was on the board was effectively discredited and taken out in 2014 to have massive reputational damage and tarnishing based upon lots of different things. And so we end up with this bankruptcy of the Bitcoin Foundation in 2014. Okay. And the players that kind of are left over is John Matonis and Brock Pierce. And Bruce Fenton, I'm not sure when he exited. But kind of the key players that are left over are Brock Pierce and John Matonis of the Bitcoin Foundation. Then we have, this new funding route on emergency, where MIT, becomes a source of funding for three of the developers, Vladimir, Gavin Andreessen, and who's the third one? I can't remember now.
Was it Vanderlaan? I think it was Vanderlaan.
Yeah. So three of the developers anyway. Then one of the initiatives that was an offshoot. So Jeffrey Epstein put some funding into this MIT initiative. Then there was the Digital Currency Initiative. And one of the things that they funded, as well as CBDC projects, what later Gary Gensler ended up joining, who's chair of the SEC, and the Bitcoin developers. So So now you had funding via DCI, you had Blockstream, you had Silicon Valley infiltrating various corporate entities or investing in various entities, and then Brock Pierce that seemed to create this Tether offshoot. And then what Brock Pierce and Gavin Andreessen and John Matonis and all these people did next is another part that I think everyone's not talking about. ...
What is it?
Okay. So I remember Brock Pierce, when I was at a Bitcoin conference, cornering me into a room, inviting me to parties, which thankfully I didn't participate in. But I know others that went to those parties and what happens at those parties. And they're things that no one wants to be associated with. And I have stories that are horrific. But Brock Pierce tried to persuade me and spent 3 hours trying to persuade me to give public support that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. And John Matonis introduced Dr. Craig Wright as Satoshi Nakamoto, and Gavin Andreessen said that he has cryptographic proof that Dr. Craig Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto. And so while you had funding, if you want to connect the dots there, into Gavin Andreessen, then you had an offshoot that put an air of credibility around Dr. Craig Wright being Satoshi Nakamoto. Then this is all on YouTube, when I confronted Dr. Craig Wright, he was pushing the whole big blocker narrative, but he refused to state that he was affiliated with Bitcoin Cash. But I pushed him on a public video. If you put in Simon Dixon, Dr. Craig Wright, where he effectively said that Bitcoin Cash was the project that he wanted to push for. Mm-hmm. And then he very publicly became a part of the general people that were pushing for Bitcoin Cash as the hard fork.
Okay, this is really interesting. Let's take a lot of time here, because this is where we really need to exchange information. All right, let's say I think we're in agreement that Brock Pierce is a very suspicious character. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. We're not in agreement about Gavin. So there's two things. Let's talk about what happened with Gavin here. One, it should be noted that Gavin was effectively pushed out of being the lead developer when that was happening at MIT. His position was changed from being the lead developer to being the chief scientist, which meant that he wasn't actually making decisions about what goes into the code and what doesn't go into the code. So this would be, let me try to paint an alternative picture here and then say how that fits into the puzzle. Alternative picture is they wanted to keep Bitcoin hijacked, to keep blocks small, to make sure that it didn't scale, to delay until we get the rollout of digital dollars. They have a problem. Let's entertain the idea that Gavin is in fact a good egg, and Gavin is technically competent and knew that the way to scale Bitcoin was in fact to raise the size of blocks. So when you have the failure of the Bitcoin Foundation and you have some of the main developers go to MIT, if one of them is trying to push for big blocks, you have to figure out what to do with him, especially when he's the guy that has so much credibility because Satoshi handed the project off to him. Well, one way you would do this is by changing his position. Well, Gavin, you're doing such great work, but why don't you look at more of the theoretical side of things? Why don't you read some of the scientific research, some of the literature, and then you'll be more of a scientist researcher line rather than managing the code, which is indeed what happened. Now with the Craig Wright situation, okay, so I want to get your claim clear so then I can ask some more questions about it. Is the idea that the fact that Gavin said that he went through a signing event with Craig, and that Craig had cryptographic proof of having ownership, I believe it was, of some very old block, or maybe he signed a message cryptographically with a key that was from one of the really old blocks, the fact that he said that means that he's disingenuous and a bad actor, there's our evidence that he's lying, in effect.
Whether he's lying, whether he's not, these are all values and judgment calls. But the sequence of events that I remember is John Matonis introduced Dr. Craig Wright. No one believed him. Brock Pierce did a covert operation in order to try and persuade anyone who's influential to publicly back. And Gavin Andreessen was the reason why people started to believe.
Yes. Yeah. I think all of that's correct. I think that's correct. Okay, so this is going to be really fun, right? Because now we got to talk about what the hell happened with Big Block Bitcoin, because we have two alternative narratives. One is Big Block Bitcoin was always a fraud in some way, and it's always a distraction, and really the small block Bitcoin, it was always Bitcoin. Another alternative is that Big Block Bitcoin actually is what Bitcoin was supposed to be, as we understand it from how Satoshi designed the thing. And so once you have Bitcoin Cash forking off, you then have a threat, you have the maintenance of a threat to the establishment. And so there has to be an attempt to infiltrate and divide and destroy Bitcoin Cash, because otherwise it actually is as threatening as the original Bitcoin to the existing financial players. And so one reasonable interpretation when playing the story out is to say, yeah, Craig Wright was in fact an op that was designed to split Bitcoin Cash in two, which it actually did. So I would say that would be consistent with my story. I'm not sure,
but he was also an op, I believe, to introduce Bitcoin Cash in the first place.
What do you mean?
There was an op to say, here's Satoshi's vision. Here is Satoshi. Here is the number one developer that Satoshi introduced.
Oh, no. Okay, that one's definitely not right. So Craig Wright didn't really come on the scene, wasn't really that relevant at that time. He really became prominent when there was infighting within the Bitcoin Cash world. And so the reason that Gavin, the most reasonable explanation that Gavin came out and said Bitcoin Cash is what was the project I got involved with originally. That's the Bitcoin I was excited about.
Do you agree? Who was the initiator of Bitcoin Cash? I believe it was Jihan Wu and Bitmain.
So Jihan Wu and Bitmain paid paid Amaury Sachet to create Bitcoin ABC as a backup option if SegWit 2x failed.
Yeah.
SegWit 2x failed, and so they've started pivoting then to Bitcoin Cash. But the hope was to keep the network together from essentially all the big blockers.
Yeah, and when I had a private meeting with Jihan Wu in his office in China around about that time, he was suggesting to me that Craig Wright was Satoshi, and he was asking a lot about core.
Yeah.
And so that was. Yeah, my private meeting with Jihan Wu in Shanghai.
Okay, so it sounds like you're putting a lot of weight on Craig Wright being evidence that all the big blockers, or let's say that the big block movement was always based on a falsehood.
Well, you had the multiple credibility. You had the credibility of Roger Ver, the credibility of Gavin Andreessen, the claims about Dr. Craig Wright. And this kind of made up like the people and then you had this Blockstream narrative, and so you had Blockstream saying here's what the small block side looked like, setting the narrative, and then you had this group that set the narrative for digital cash. So then you set the whole thing of the digital cash versus digital gold.
Okay, so. What about this possibility? Gavin didn't lie. Gavin was tricked in a very simple and straightforward way that he sort of talked about, or hinted at, or pointed at, which is that when they did this key signing, the people that were doing the performance in front of him they used their own laptop. They claimed, oh, we got a fresh laptop from Best Buy or whatever. And they opened it up. They did the key signing, and if the actual hardware was compromised, then the cryptographic verification is completely out the window. You can prove whatever you want to prove if the laptop is compromised. So it very well could be the case that if we're dealing with an op here, Gavin Andreessen was actually telling the truth, that this signing did in fact happen, that the way Craig was talking could be consistent with the way Satoshi was talking, because Craig was clearly a big blocker, Satoshi was clearly a big blocker, Mike Hearn was clearly, everybody, who was asking those questions at that time, who'd been around that long, they all understood you have to raise the size of the blocks. Mm-hmm. And so that was the op that they got. That I agree, John Matonis himself didn't have the credibility. Brock Pierce certainly wouldn't have. I had never heard before that that he was going around trying to pitch Craig as Satoshi. That's extremely suspicious. But also, why couldn't Gavin just have been could have been tricked? Wouldn't that be a easy explanation?
Yeah, but it's also equally suspicious that someone of that caliber that understood more than anyone else.
Not at all. No, he actually wrote about it in his blog. People were asking him immediately.
Sure, he's got his story. And,
no. But hang on. He's admitted to this. People ask him immediately.
He was tricked. Yeah.
Well, no, specifically about the laptop. They said, okay, Gavin is saying the such and such happened, and they asked him, well, was it your laptop or was it a laptop that they brought? And people said, well, and he said it was a laptop they used. And then they asked him, well, could that have been compromised? He said, yes, that could have been.
So he has his cover story, right? We have to assume we don't trust anyone. That's the whole point of Bitcoin, right? Don't trust.
I don't think that's right. I don't think that works. I think that's a narrative. That's a story of what we wanted Bitcoin to be. That doesn't.
Everything we're talking about is a narrative. The fact that Gavin Andreessen got tricked and he had his story of how he got tricked, we either believe him or we don't believe him. That's it. But there was the potential to either have been tricked or been in on something, been compromised. There's no doubt that those are two options.
It's certainly true. It would seem like if this was a scheme, you would imagine he wouldn't admit that it wasn't his laptop. He could have literally just said, no, I brought my laptop. I did my laptop and I made sure that the USB drive was fresh. That's all he needed to do. It would be very weird.
Intelligence agencies set up a movie for their ops. Like we can either believe or we can just say these are possibilities.
Well, I'm just saying, if we're going to entertain the idea that Gavin was in on it, a critical piece of the story that you're telling is the fact that he came out and said such and such happened, and this is why I believe
that's the key thing.
Yeah, but
he said.
He also said and admitted that it wasn't his laptop. So like it's sort of like, if we're talking about the great heist.
Yeah, but how do we know? Just because he said, that's it. That's all we got. Hearsay. But if we're in court, it's hearsay.
But what I'm saying is it would be such a terrible op if you've got this grand scheme that's been laid out over 15 years, and then the critical trust node, which is Gavin, he really was the guy that there was a bunch of people who took Craig seriously because of Gavin, because he did seem to be trustworthy. If that's a critical piece of the puzzle and he comes out and says, oh yeah, I didn't even use my own laptop, well, then the credibility sort of gets undermined very easily. Like you could literally just...
Based upon what he said?
Yeah, why wouldn't he?
Do you trust what he says?
But because he literally could have sidestepped all of that by just saying, "Oh no, of course I used my own laptop. I'm not a fool," and people would have trusted that he used his own laptop, right? So it's like,
yeah, but he needed his plausible deniability, or it was what happened. Who knows? But all I'm saying is that if we're going down these different routes. My personal belief, my belief here is that there was a divide and conquer operation, and it infiltrated everything.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And some people are saying, no, those were the bad people, and the other people are saying, no, those were the bad people. When the reality is that if you want to create a gateway drug for a central bank digital currency, and you want to fracture this community because essentially, whether this was an intelligence project or not, and it became open source, then divide and conquer is 1000% the exact strategy that every military playbook uses. Create separatist movements, fracture them off, and then, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Like, this is playbook. How they destroy countries.
I think that's totally reasonable. I'm just saying, it would seem like that is entirely consistent with the idea that the op was Craig and not Gavin. So if in that story,
Right.
which I
They
think
could be the compromise networks as you come at it from every way you can. When you're trying to compromise a jury, you try and get every jury member. When you're trying to compromise a judge, you get all the judges. Like this is how it works.
Sure, but we do have evidence of Gavin turning down Epstein, so there's a little bit of evidence of at least him having some resilience to that. And also, whether or not Gavin is a live player or a part of the compromise network actually greatly changes the picture of the history of what happened to Bitcoin. So suddenly it would be, we would say, okay, well, maybe Gavin then was caught in it. He was actually, look, the fact that he admits it wasn't even my laptop, that's embarrassing. Like if he's
that's part of your plausible deniability story. Like
well, okay. So if my story is correct, I think that's the easier interpretation. Then it also would vindicate somebody like Roger, because I think I don't want to speak for him. I am assuming that he, like others, put a lot of credibility in what Gavin had to say. So Roger then was actually.
It doesn't necessarily vindicate. We don't know where the trickery happened or who was in on the trickery.
Right.
The fact is people got tricked.
What I'm saying is we're entertaining two hypotheses, and in the one story, which I currently believe to be the accurate story, Craig is probably somehow an op. Gavin was not. Gavin was actually a good actor who was tricked by intelligence agencies who intended to divide and conquer, as you were talking about. But also that means there still are good guys. There still are good guys and bad guys in the story. Like if the big blocker
good and bad is the wrong way of framing. You're adding your emotion there. It is
no. So
asset or compromise, and that's not good.
No, let me say why it's good or bad. So it's good or bad in the sense that if the big blocker story is correct, that in fact Bitcoin was designed to be peer-to-peer cash without intermediaries, and it could do that, it could scale, and in fact it was hijacked so that it couldn't scale to push people into second layers, I'm going to say the Satoshi spirit, those are the good guys. We want to have a real alternative currency that is used as an alternative to the fiat system that you don't need to go through third parties. I'm going to say those are the good, right? So
that's 100% confirmation bias based upon your belief around what the mission was. And we're still in the same debate, and we're not going to have that debate. But my point is digital currency, digital gold, divide and conquer, multiple operations, multiple infiltrations, in order to eventually end up with what you really wanted, which is everyone's Bitcoin in a custodian with BlackRock, everyone's Bitcoin in a custodian with Coinbase, except you still have the escape valves for the elites that want to own Bitcoin in self-custody. You then create the whole derivative complex and financial industrial complex that they've already built through people like Michael Saylor and treasury companies and ETFs and banks on, Bitcoin on bank balance sheets. And there is nothing unique about Bitcoin that wouldn't stop that from happening from whatever became the number one coin. Like there is nothing about Bitcoin Cash that would have stopped. I remember very well when BitThumb was used in order to manipulate the price of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash to try and scare the shit out of people into thinking they should sell their Bitcoin, buy their Bitcoin Cash. I remember all the spam bot attacks. I remember trying to really push up all the transaction fees, all the games that were played. During that whole debate.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of those because those are going to be historically relevant here. Is the idea that the high transaction fees on Bitcoin that was part of an op that wasn't because the tech wasn't scaling correctly?
Well, a little bit of both, but I believe that there was the whole debate around spam transaction fees and the whole debate, which I just don't think we should necessarily have because we've litigated all of this. The point is that there were two visions of how to scale Bitcoin, and I think both of those were sufficient evidence that there was compromised networks in order to divide and conquer. And to say that just because I believe that Satoshi's vision was here, my personal belief is that who I believe Satoshi was, released Bitcoin, and whatever his vision is completely irrelevant to where the project ended up going. Okay. The project ended up going because there were an open source project with ops in order to try and push people in different directions, and everyone went in that direction. And Bitcoin wasn't hijacked because there is consensus around the different layers of Bitcoin and its construct, whether it be miners, whether it be mining pools, whether it be nodes, whether it be open source development, that we are still in an open source boardroom of the most decentralized project with pockets of centralization and compromise that exists in the world today at the level of security that we currently have.
How is it decentralized? Like, can you explain what that word means?
Because there are different parts of the ecosystem, and every time one of them gets too close to being too centralized, and there is a risk factor out there, then different parts of the community can pivot off in a different direction. And we still have the most secure and the most decentralized we can have with lots of problems.
So is the idea that what keeps it decentralized is that projects can fork off?
Well, at every layer of compromise, we're developing more and more systems like knots versus core, alternative implementations on nodes. We've got multiple mining pools, and we've got examples of when a mining pool becomes too influential, people can move it. We got technology that means mining pools can have different, layers and different innovation. You've got multiple examples of when mining gets centralized in one country, one structure. We've got private companies, public companies. We've got countries that hate each other mining at the sovereign level. You've got all these different, types of things. And then we've got now a bunch of developers that when people draw too much attention or push too much attention, some of them lose their commit access. It changes. And so when you put all of these pieces together, you've got what Bitcoin is today. It was never hijacked. Bitcoin is continually attempting to be hijacked.
Yeah.
It's the best we got.
It seems like, so I'm going to draw like the opposite conclusion of a bunch of those examples. So when you say people are losing their commit access, that's not an organic thing. Like there some people have commit access and some people don't. And there's like a handful of people that make those decisions. That's when Gavin. So if you recall, when Gavin came out, actually, it said that he thought Craig Wright was Satoshi. That's when they formally stripped him of his commit access, right? So that was a decision that was made by some individuals. So it's what I see is the opposite. I see you already have massive centralization of mining everywhere. You have mass centralization of node development. There's one serious node implementation, then there's one new competing alternative. But if there's disagreements and the way that decentralization is preserved is by one group forking off, well, that's already what happened with Bitcoin Cash. So you'd have BTC, the chain that can never innovate, can never upgrade, can never do anything because the handful of people with commit access are the ones that are actually calling the shots. I just don't see it as decentralized.
Yeah, but we know that there's more than just a bunch of developers saying it. There's narrative, there's rallying, there's user-activated soft fork, there's hard forks, there's miners, there's mining pools. All of these people make up the ecosystem of what eventually gets consensus. There is definitely pockets of centralization that are less than perfect.
Yeah.
But that's not solved by someone else having a more centralized version of that.
No,
and if that project became the number one, it would still suffer all the same types of attack vectors.
Yeah, I think this idea of consensus is the word here that I just completely disagree with. I think that's a mirage. I think this is a tool. So what wound up winning was a veto power. Veto power wins, or functionally that's what happened. You could have the entire industry, the corporate industry, if you want to call it that, outside of Blockstream and Bitfinex, that decide this includes, in fact, some core developers saying, yeah, of course we need to increase the block size to 2 megabytes. that absolutely paltry concession wasn't made because hell was raised to prevent any changes from happening. So I don't. The idea that there's consensus, the Hong Kong agreement was the closest thing we ever got to consensus in Bitcoin. That was virtually the entire industry agreeing that this is the thing we're going to do, and yet the veto card was played by the people that control core development.
Well, wasn't there a user-activated soft fork? Wasn't there massive pockets of lobbying? Weren't the venture capitalists all trying to pull together? Didn't Barry Silbert try and put together?
Yeah,
like there were multiple layers.
Yeah.
There was no chance that you could say that. Of course, core had a voice.
There was a lot of work. So it's sort of like politics, right? There's a lot of people debating things. There's a lot of people saying things and doing things, but most of it doesn't matter. Like if there's a handful of people that have commit access that determine what goes into Bitcoin software and what doesn't, you can have all the things you're describing, and they're not really related to the decisions that a handful of people are making, what goes into the software or what doesn't. As we've seen, as demonstrated perfectly what happened during the block size war, right? That would be the example of mass centralization, that it turns out to be the developers are the ones that are calling the shot, and then by extension, the people that are funding the developers are the ones that are calling the shots.
But that's not the whole piece there. Like there are developers right now that are going in different directions, looking at soft forks, looking at alternative implementations, and they're all debating right now, and they're saying this one's compromised, that one's compromised.
Yeah.
And this is the open source boardroom that we have.
Yeah, but what's going to come of it?
These are humans that are flawed because they can be compromised and they can engage in censorship. And there are brutal games that are played. And many of those games were played and all of them are deployed. But to say that this is hijacked and that there is just the core developers that control this project in its entirety, is just not the reality.
No, there are other people who are connected to them, but I'm saying the people that are calling the shots are obviously the core developers. There's a bunch of talking and a bunch of hooting and hollering.
In terms of one part.
In terms of what goes into Bitcoin's code, which controls the structure of the network at the most fundamental level. What's
an alternative model to that?
So that's an excellent question. And I think what we have to do is grow up and realize that you're always going to have centralized development. Correct. You can't not have centralized development. The problem is that is actually a measure of competence of the people who are calling the shots in the development teams. Competence and compromise. So if you're going to say that there is a hierarchy here and there are people who are calling the shots, that's just how the world works. Then the question is, okay, let's examine who's calling the shots in Bitcoin. It's the Bitcoin core developers who have decided we're going to pivot away from Satoshi's design unambiguously. They've like admitted this is the case.
Yeah, that's narrative. Like,
no, what part's narrative?
Again, like making changes was the whole debate. You know what that is, whether that's Satoshi's vision, whether it's relevant that it's Satoshi's vision.
So just to be clear, you don't think it's clear that Satoshi envisioned Bitcoin being used as a peer-to-peer currency, even in examples like using it in a vending machine?
Yes, I think that's clear. Yeah, I think that's what Satoshi originally wanted.
Okay, so then and do you think it's also clear that Satoshi intended Bitcoin to scale with block size increases?
Yeah, I think that's clear.
Okay, then I don't. What's the narrative? All I'm saying is
what did the community end up doing in this whole open source boardroom in a mechanism where there are different players?
I don't buy the open source community.
Do you believe that Satoshi Nakamoto, in its original design, had figured out all the problems that whenever you develop technology, you inevitably find out as you decide where this project goes next?
No. So I don't think he was perfect. However, if we're talking about like network design, it would be uncontroversial and obvious that the whole way Satoshi envisioned this system of working was not everybody's running their own node. And he literally talked about that. It was you're going to have big blocks and you're going to have what's called SPV. which means that you don't have to run your own full node, because obviously that network wouldn't scale. It's just a matter of fact that network design doesn't work. And it doesn't need to work because that's not what how does Satoshi designed it to work. And he was like unambiguous about that. I don't buy the idea that it's an organic process. It's an open source community at all. We had Satoshi, who was the leader of the project, calling the shots, and then it was Gavin, and Gavin gave his commit access to several different people. Those people eventually kicked him out of the project, and the people that are calling the shots are those that have the commit access to the Bitcoin Core repository. And almost everything else is just chatter and irrelevant. A great example of this is some of the stuff that's happened in Bitcoin right now, where ironically, there's a new civil war that's happening. Is Bitcoin going to be spamified or not? Are you going to have a bunch of data in op return or not? Ironically, a lot of the Bitcoin Core people are now making the arguments we were making 10 years ago. And in fact, they made some changes.
That's healthy, right? That's not a hijack project. That is people saying that they're advocating for what you wanted years ago.
No. I would say it's the opposite, right? That unfortunately the technical details are going to matter here, but the concession that in fact the big blockers were technically correct on this claim as well is kind of hilarious in hindsight. But I bring it up as an example to say, there were these naive souls that thought they were part of a decentralized decision-making process. They're a part of the community, and they feel very strongly that op return is spam, and they're node runners, and they don't want to have op return data in their nodes, and so they're going to voice their opinions. And they were using the arguments that they had heard from small block folks a decade ago. So in that sense, they're sort of like bless their heart.
One could argue that maybe they're compromised in the direction that Craig Wright was compromised.
But the funny point in all of this is none of their arguments mattered at all, because they actually made decisions despite there being community disagreement. It doesn't matter that at the end of the day, it's a handful of people that are calling the shots of what goes into the code and what doesn't. And people, talk the meetings of what happens on Twitter and the different power players, that turns out really not to matter because of the way that the GitHub access works.
It does, because there is miner power and there is node power, and that is the mechanism and the checks and balances and the system that we have.
Okay, but
there is venture capital power, there is corporate power, and there are lots of power structures and power factions.
Well, but didn't we see that with the miner, like with miner power, for example? Didn't we see during the block size war? It doesn't matter because we had more than 80% of the network was signaling block size increase, and then it didn't happen because the core developers didn't code it in. So that power can't be that great.
Okay, well we have. But what I'm saying is we still have the most decentralized and secure project that has checks and balances, pockets of centralization, imperfect structure, imperfect decision-making. But I still have a project where I'm able to own my own money in self-custody, spend my value, leave the country, do whatever I want, and a monetary policy that I believe will never change.
Look, why don't you believe the monetary policy will change? Could it change?
In theory, it can, but there's a lot of layers that are required in order to change that monetary policy. And if that monetary policy does change, that's the end. That's my point of saying I'm out.
Are you aware that Peter Todd,
the mechanism for getting that monetary policy to change, I think, is virtually impossible.
Are you aware that Peter Todd, for example, the core developer who played a role, we say, in the hijacking of Bitcoin, has already proposed on multiple occasions changing the 21 million limit?
Yes, and Peter Todd, in my estimation, is a bad actor, a compromise actor, somebody that's not ideologically aligned with.
So would it be true to say that given that even parameters like the 21 million limit are changeable, that you're trusting that for a set of reasons and a set of incentives, you're trusting that that those changes won't happen because you trust some individuals that have power? You think that will prevent that from happening?
There is trust at every part of the network, but in its entirety and our very well-defined process, we're about to see the soft fork process. We've seen the hard fork process. And at every layer, we've seen what happens when a mining pool gets too much power. We've seen what happens when the community split. We've seen all of these different things. But to say that Peter Todd on his own, as somebody that was compromised, could change the monetary policy of Bitcoin is impossible.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. The reason I ask is because most people aren't even aware that that variable can change. And what I have seen, empirically speaking, and being in Bitcoin,
everything can change in any project.
That's right. But most people don't.
This
But most people don't understand that with Bitcoin, right? You have got a bunch of people that think Bitcoin is some system that's outside of the power of humans. Nobody can change it no matter what. That's what gives it its value. But in fact, it's a social thing, and all of the variables can change. And the reason I bring up Peter Todd, because he did turn out to have influence then, I think does have some influence now. But if we play out a scenario in which more than, and it's been more than Peter Todd.
I think Peter Todd, I mean, from my perspective, we're all dealing with human perceptions here, but Peter Todd is severely discredited.
Okay, well, so what I have seen is that it was also severely discredited back in the day to think that the block size limit was never going to be increased. Nobody had that position. Greg Maxwell didn't have that position. Adam Back didn't have that position. That was like a wild-eyed idea, and yet that's what we wound up with. And for example, it's a better example than Peter Todd. So Michael Saylor is somebody that has a lot of influence. And he has proposed funding core development. He wants to fund core developers because he thinks the current set of developers are too reckless and he wants the protocol to be set in stone. Okay, well, let's imagine a circumstance in which he can fund $1 billion or plus, he and his extended network, into funding core development. So instead of Bitcoin Core that had their funding from whatever source, it's Bitcoin Saylor. And that they end up having commit access. Okay, now play it out 5, 10, 15 years. The idea that, actually this is quite realistic, they're going to run into a security problem, which is, how do we fund miners to continue mining on the network when the block rewards have gone away and there aren't enough transaction fees to pay for mining. So that is an inevitable problem that Bitcoin will be facing in the future. It's completely reasonable to think that one of the possible solutions that Saylor Core developers will come up with is simply having an indefinite emission of Bitcoin, because in fact that does solve the problem, and this is why Peter Todd has proposed it, is because it actually does solve the technical issue. So why wouldn't that seems like that's an entirely reasonable story to tell? Then that would imply that this is not a decentralized system that's just centralized based on who is funding the important developers at that given time.
Yeah, but that would go through the process. There would be resistance against that. There would be alternative funding. There would be different teams. There would be everything that we've already seen, whether it's the soft fork process, the hard fork process, the user activated soft fork, whatever process we would go through. I would resist that. Community members would resist that. I'd use my influence over certain companies to resist, and everyone would do the same. And that's the process.
Do you think the network would fork?
If he specifically wanted to?
Yeah, if he said, so we have a real problem, which is that we don't have enough transaction fees to pay for miner security, and so we're going to solve this by having indefinite tail emission of Bitcoin. So technically, it's not a 21 million limit, but it would be
a massive heated debate. I think that it would be very, very hard to get that, and I think we'd go through a similar process to what we're going through now, where people would be calling each other out, and people would say you're compromised, and we go through this whole process. And so, again, I'm not saying this is a perfect system. I'm saying it's the best system we got.
Okay. Well, so I think there's a lot more we could talk about on these lines, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm proud that we didn't get wrapped up in too much technical detail. I thought we would, and I'm glad we haven't. Is there anything else that you want to say in terms of the alternative picture that you're painting? Because right now, what has been proposed is that maybe Gavin and Roger are compromised people, and so that's where we get the big blocker thing is based on compromise. They aren't the good guys, let's say. Are there other pieces of the puzzle here that you think people are missing?
No, I mean we could go into the future around like what happened with Gary Gensler and Operation Choke Point 2.0, but I don't think we should. I think this is the key thing. And if I were to speculate, I believe that Adam Back is a bad actor. Brock
Agreed.
Pierce is a bad actor.
Agreed.
I think and I think we should. Uh, Dr. Craig Wright is definitely a bad actor.
Yep.
And I personally think Peter Todd is a bad actor.
Yes. Strongly agree.
And I think the rest, it's up to debate the layer of how autonomous they are, their real opinion, what really happened. I think it's all open to interpretation. But I'm pretty confident in saying those people are bad actors.
Yes, and though we're going to end up disagreeing about many things, I agree with that list. So I think that's a great note to end on. And I really appreciate your time. And this is an unfolding story, right? We don't know what else is going to be discovered here. And I get the impression that you've got an open mind and are still trying to figure things out. So I respect that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as I said, it's nice that we can respect that. And there's only one thing that matters to me in the end is accuracy. There are things that are opinions. There are things that are inaccurate and accurate. We're going to find out in the end. But I'm not ready to give up on this project.
Okay, and I am. So, fellow Bitcoiner. Okay, we agree on a lot. We have a lot. It sounds like there's a lot we're going to disagree on, but I think that we're going to agree on a lot more. And I do think it's over. I mean, just my personal opinion is like crypto entirely as an entire industry might actually be over. There's a couple of exceptions, maybe with privacy coins, but I just think all signs point to it was co-opted and digital dollars on crypto rails. That's the future. Unfortunately, yes. Devastating, heartbreaking, but I think that's the world we're going into.
Oh, we're definitely going into that world. But the question is there an exit? And I believe that that there is an exit. I think I live that exit. I think other people can live that exit. And I think Bitcoin will give more power to power. Bitcoin doesn't fix everything. There are people that can engage in crimes against humanity using Bitcoin. And there are people that will use Bitcoin for good. And this whole financial industrial complex, I believe Bitcoin in custody is co-opted. But the ability to own Bitcoin in self-custody, run your own node, is, I think, the best that we have.
Okay, one question. When you say, I was going to say, great way to end and signing off. Okay, but you said, and the ability to run your own node. So what is it that you think you gain from running your own node in particular?
I think the user-activated soft fork is a thing. It is a layer of defense. I think having 25,000 nodes, being able to verify my transactions, being able to do that trivially, and back up my copy of the blockchain.
But you can verify your own transactions without running your own node. You just can't verify other people's transactions.
Yeah, there's alternatives, of course.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't want to crack open that door because I think we've had a very productive conversation. And again, I appreciate your time. Is there so for people who don't know about you, where can they go to learn more and see more of your content?
Yeah, and again, I really focus on geopolitics, attack vectors, macroeconomics, where Bitcoin fits into the world of tech, this whole surveillance state that's being built. So I go live on YouTube every Friday for about 4 hours following money. I spend about 5% on Bitcoin, 95% on monetary flows.
Okay.
I'm regularly on X, and I've got my website, simondixon.com, in case I get taken out from any of these more centralized services.
Okay, great. And if people don't know, also for me, if you're interested, steve-patterson.com is going to be my website, where you can check out the different projects I'm involved with there. All right. Thanks again for your time, Simon.
Thank you. Cheers, Steve.